It begins like a whisper that drifts through abandoned towns, the kind of rumor people repeat in half-shaken voices, too uncertain to call it truth, too terrified to dismiss it as a lie. A house on the edge of America's quiet countryside, wrapped in silence and shadows, hiding something no visitor should ever see. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because tonight we travel into the darkness of one family's secret, a story America tried to bury, but whispers have refused to let die. The year was 1957, when the neighbors first began to wonder why the young girl of the family never appeared in town anymore. She had been a fragile child, often seen with her head bowed, her voice rarely carrying above a whisper. But then, suddenly, she was gone from sight. No school attendance, no church presence, no visits to the market. Just gone, like the earth had swallowed her whole. Behind those drawn curtains and heavy oak doors, her brother, a man no older than his late 20s, had already slipped into madness. He believed the world was corrupt, poisonous, and that his sister was the last remaining vessel of innocence. He told himself chains were protection, confinement was salvation. What outsiders would call cruelty, he named devotion. But what lies bind stronger than steel? In that lonely home, the girl lived years tethered to rusted iron, her spirit gnawed by the ceaseless echo of clinking links against the wooden floor. To the brother, it was the sound of safety. To her, it was the sound of a life being devoured, one breath at a time. And yet, no one asked too many questions. The America of the 1950s was wrapped in pride and secrecy, a culture that polished its surface for the world while hiding its darkest truths beneath rotting floorboards. People saw what they wanted to see. A recla, Yusuf family, a stern brother, a sister who was simply absent. But if silence could speak, those walls would have screamed. The strange thing about secrets is how they rot in plain sight, feeding on silence until the stench seeps out into the air. For years, the brother convinced himself that no one would notice, but people always notice. They just pretend not to. The neighbors whispered, of course. They whispered about the strange thuds at night, the flicker of lanterns burning until dawn, the sound of wood being dragged across floorboards when no one should have been awake. They whispered about why the sister never appeared on Christmas, not even at the church services where every pew was expected to be filled. Yet, when confronted, the brother smiled that uncanny smile of his, wide and stretched, like someone trying to copy a photograph of normality. And in those times, people told themselves it was nothing. After all, who wanted to believe the unthinkable? Inside, though, the truth was building. The girl was not just chained, she was conditioned, stripped piece by piece of her sense of self. Every word spoken to her carried the weight of his doctrine. He told her the outside world would destroy her. He told her that only he could keep her safe. He told her that her suffering was proof of her purity. Imagine the mind unraveling under such twisted sermons, until captivity no longer felt like punishment but destiny. And the brother, what kind of sickness drives a man to turn his blood into a prisoner? Some historians believe it was paranoia, sharpened by isolation. Others whisper darker theories, obsession, lust, an echo of sins passed down through bloodlines too tangled to name. In those days, when families buried their darkest truths under the floorboards. Such perversions grew like weeds in the dark, thriving in secrecy. But cracks cannot be sealed forever. When one of the delivery men claimed he saw a pale hand clutch the frame of an upstairs window, only to be yanked back in an instant, the rumors took on a life of their own. The question was no longer if something was wrong inside that house. The question was how deep the horror reached, and whether anyone would dare uncover it. The chains were not only iron, they were psychological, generational, spiritual, and they were tightening with every passing year. History often buries its ugliest truths, but when they claw their way to the surface, they leave scars across generations. The house of the brother and sister was becoming such a scar, though few dared to look directly at it. The delivery man's account circulated in whispers, carried from bar stools to church pews. Still, no one stepped forward to confront the brother. Fear works quietly, doesn't it? Not fear of him alone, but fear of what exposing him might mean. Fear of having to admit that something monstrous could grow inside an American family, in the safety of a small, God-fearing town. The silence of others became the second lock on the girl's chains. Inside, time twisted unnaturally. Days bled into nights without change. The sister, once a child with fragile laughter, grew into a woman shackled by the weight of years. Her body grew older, but her world remained the size of a dim room, her companions nothing but walls, shadows, and the voice of her brother repeating his sermons of fear. She was told that beyond the door lay corruption, violence, and ruin, and so the girl, though desperate for freedom, trembled at the thought of leaving. The prison became a paradox, hated, yet trusted. The brother himself transformed too. With each passing year, his obsession deepened. He abandoned work, friendships, any semblance of normal life, pouring everything into his vigil. His hair grew wild, his eyes hollow, his voice the cracked tone of a prophet no one wanted to follow. He told himself he was chosen to protect her, that he alone could shield her from sin. But what he truly craved was control, the kind that seeps into the marrow of another human until they no longer know where their own thoughts end and another's begin. It might have gone on forever, just another unspoken tragedy hidden in plain sight, if not for the storm of 1962. Rain lashed at the town for 3 days, flooding cellars, breaking trees, and tearing away rooftops. When the storm passed, part of the brothers' home was damaged, exposing the upstairs to the open sky. That was when neighbors claimed they heard it for the first time. The faintest echo of a woman's voice carried on the wet wind, raw and broken, calling out from somewhere she should not have been. It was not enough to prove, but it was enough to haunt. The storm had passed, but it left more than broken branches and flooded fields in its wake. It left suspicion, sharpened by the echo of that unseen voice. A handful of townsfolk gathered their courage to speak quietly among themselves, weighing the danger of meddling against the weight of silence. But America in those years had a strange way of protecting its illusions. People believed in the perfect family, the clean white fence, the Sunday church pews filled row by row. To look too closely at the brothers' house was to admit that the dream itself was flawed. So again, they turned away. But not everyone. A traveling priest, newly assigned to the nearby parish, heard the whispers during confession. He was a man who had seen suffering in post-war Europe, who had looked into the eyes of both victims and perpetrators. And what he heard in those hushed voices stirred something that could not be ignored. He walked to the edge of town and saw the house for himself, the shutters nailed shut, the garden untended, a chimney that puffed smoke at odd hours of the night. Something, he felt, was festering inside. That night, as he prayed, the priest wrote in his journal that he had dreamt of chains. Not gleaming, new ones, but rusted, ancient links, as though they had existed longer than the people bound in them. The dream unsettled him, and when he awoke, he made a vow. He would confront the brother, no matter the cost. Inside the house, the sister felt the shift. Captives always do. When the outside world begins to stir, even the air in the cell seems to change. She had heard the storm, tasted the rain through cracks in the roof, and for the first time in years, felt something other than dust and darkness. That fleeting taste of freedom awakened a hunger she had almost forgotten. She began to resist in subtle ways, delaying obedience, staring too long at the door, asking questions. Her brother would not answer. The brother sensed it too. And fear makes men dangerous. His sermons grew harsher, his punishments colder. He reinforced her chains, both iron and psychological, repeating over and over that she was his responsibility, his sacred burden, his prisoner of love. But beneath his words, there was panic. Panic that someone might finally hear what the storm had carried into the world, her voice. The house had become a ticking clock, and everyone, inside and out, could feel it. The confrontation came quietly, as most turning points in history do. No crowds, no sirens, just the creak of a door opening to a house that had swallowed years whole. The priest knocked, and when the brother appeared, it was as if two worlds collided. The crumbling mask of righteousness meeting the steady gaze of a man unwilling to look away. Neighbors who later recalled the moment said the two men stood in silence for far too long, locked in some wordless battle of wills. The priest finally asked if the sister was well, if she was safe, if she would come to Mass. The brother's eyes narrowed, and his smile spread too wide. He said she was fine, that she was protected, that the outside world would only ruin her. His voice cracked on that last word, as though he knew the priest had already seen through him. Inside, the sister heard every syllable. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It had been years since anyone had asked about her well-being. Years since her existence had been acknowledged beyond the sermons of her brother. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt visible. And visibility is the beginning of liberation. But liberation never comes without cost. The brother, shaken by the priest's persistence, tightened his hold. The punishments became more severe. The chains pulled tighter. The sermons dripping with rage. He warned her that if she ever dared cry out again, no one would save her. That her only salvation lay within the walls of that house, under his watchful eye. Yet, something inside her shifted. Once the thought of freedom enters, it never leaves. She began to test her limits. Small acts of rebellion, a glance through a crack in the boards, a whispered prayer when she was alone, a memory of the world outside the chains. Each small act was a rebellion, a spark threatening to ignite a fire. And the priest did not leave. He returned again and again, knocking, asking, insisting. The townsfolk grew restless, torn between their fear of scandal and the undeniable feeling that something unnatural lived in that house. Rumors no longer stayed whispers. They began to crawl into daylight. And the brother, once untouchable, began to feel the weight of eyes pressing against his shutters. It was no longer just a house of silence. It was becoming a stage, and the world was beginning to watch. By the mid-1960s, the brother's house had become both fortress and cage, not only for his sister but for himself. His obsession had turned inward, poisoning him as much as it imprisoned her. The priest's persistence, the whispers of neighbors, the subtle shifts in the air, all of it gnawed at his fragile sense of control. He began to see threats everywhere, in every knock at the door, every lingering glance from a passerby, every sermon at the church that seemed to speak of hidden sins. Paranoia bloomed like mold in the dark. The sister, however, was transforming. Years of silence had hollowed her, but the faint taste of freedom, the memory of rain, the echo of an outside voice, the priest's insistence, had lit something deep within her. She began to count the days, scratching faint marks where no eye but hers could see. She began to imagine, really imagine, what lay beyond the door. In her dreams, she walked streets she had nearly forgotten, felt grass against her feet, sunlight on her skin. Her mind, though battered, was learning to hope again. But hope is dangerous when shackled. The brother, sensing her shifting spirit, sought to bind her more tightly. He removed windows, boarded doors, reinforced locks. He treated her not as a sister, but as a possession slipping from his grasp. In his journals, never meant to be found, he wrote that she was the last pure thing in a world of decay. His language blurred the line between reverence and domination, between guardian and captor. And in those lines one can almost hear the echo of ancient, cursed family patterns, obsession disguised as duty, control disguised as love. The town, too, was restless. Children dared one another to approach the house, to throw stones at the boarded windows, only to flee when they swore they heard chains rattling in reply. Adults avoided the place, yet spoke of it more openly than ever. Fear as transforming into fascination, fascination into horror. For decades, secrecy had protected the brother. Now, secrecy was unraveling, thread by thread, exposing the rot beneath. It was no longer a question of whether the truth would come out, but when. The brother could feel the tide turning, and in that knowledge lay his greatest fear. For when the world sees what has been hidden, it never looks away again. The final unraveling came not with fire and fury, but with a single mistake. For years, the brother had survived on secrecy, believing that shadows would always hide him. But shadows shift, and in one careless moment, he let the outside world glimpse what had been hidden for nearly a decade. It was late one summer evening when a young boy, chasing a stray dog, slipped into the edge of the brother's property. He crept close enough to the house to hear what sounded like metal dragging against wood. And then, just for an instant, he saw her. A pale figure at the window, eyes wide, hair tangled, her lips forming words he could not hear. Chains glinted faintly in the dying light. Terrified, the boy ran, but he did not stay silent. He told his parents, and unlike the whispers of the past, this time the story spread like wildfire. The priest returned with others at his side. Their fists pounded on the door demanding answers. The brother refused, his face wild with defiance, his voice cracking as he screamed that they would never take her, that she belonged to him, that the world was corrupt. Behind the door, his sister trembled, caught between terror of the outside and the faintest hope that rescue had finally come. The door was broken open. The smell of rust and decay rushed out, along with the hollow silence of years. They found her inside, shackled by both iron and fear, her body weakened, but her eyes, those haunted eyes, still alive. Alive enough to tell the world that she had survived what no one should. The brother was dragged from the house, still shouting, still insisting he had saved her. History would write him as a monster, and rightly so, but in his mind he remained a prophet betrayed. The sister was carried into the light, though freedom is never simple. Chains may be removed in an instant, but the scars they leave, on skin, on memory, on soul, remain long after, and so the house was left to rot. Some say it still stands, abandoned, sagging under the weight of its own silence. A monument to secrecy, to obsession, to the horrors families bury, until the ground itself can no longer contain them. The story became legend, but the scars, they were real.